Close your eyes, if you wish, and allow yourself to drift back in time to another world, a world of shadows and flickering lamplight, a world of polished boots on cobblestone streets, of fog rolling in from the river, and of lives hidden behind curtains and heavy wooden doors. It is the time of Queen Victoria, the 19th century, when London was the beating heart of an empire that stretched across the seas, a city swollen with people, crowded with industry, and alive with both splendor and suffering. Imagine yourself stepping gently into that city, as though through a dream, moving slowly through the night as the bustle of the day fades into a more secret rhythm. The gas lamps cast their glow, but they do not banish the darkness entirely. Instead, they paint long shadows on damp stone walls, and the fog curls around them like pale smoke. The rattle of carriage wheels echoes in the distance, mingling with the occasional cry of a street seller still calling out his wares, or the faint laughter spilling from a tavern doorway. This is the London of the Victorian age, a city where the respectable and the disreputable lived side by side, often closer than they would ever admit. Picture the grand avenues of the West End, where wealthy gentlemen in top hats stroll home from the theater, their walking sticks tapping a confident rhythm, and carriages pull up before glittering ballrooms where music and laughter echo late into the night. Now contrast this with the narrow lanes of the East End, where whole families cram into single damp rooms, where hunger gnaws at the stomach, and where the streets never seem to sleep. It is here, in the poorer quarters, but also tucked away even in the wealthiest neighborhoods, that another world exists, hidden in plain sight, a world of women who live in the margins of respectability, who survive by selling something society desires but refuses to openly acknowledge. This is the world of the Victorian brothel worker, and tonight we will step gently into that world, not to sensationalize it, but to understand it, to feel the texture of life as it was lived, to imagine the sights, the sounds, and the emotions of those who lived it, and to give voice, however softly, to those whose lives were often silenced. As you settle deeper into this imagined journey, let us slow the pace even further, as though walking through the city with deliberate, quiet steps. Imagine the cold air brushing against your face, the faint scent of smoke from countless chimneys blending with the damp smell of the river. Around you, the city feels both alive and weary. A newsboy shouts the last edition of the paper, his voice carrying through the fog. A weary woman sells matches from a basket, hoping to earn enough pennies to buy a bit of bread. Horses snort and stamp at their harnesses, their breath steaming in the lamplight. And here and there, if you look closely, you see figures moving quietly, women leaning in shadowed doorways, calling softly to passers-by, their voices lilting, persuasive, tinged with a mix of weariness and hope. Behind them, a dim light burns in an upstairs window. These are the signs, subtle and yet unmistakable, of the brothel houses that dotted Victorian London. But before we step inside, let us linger for a moment in the world outside, for it is in the contrast between the respectable facade of the city and the hidden underworld beneath it that the true story lies. Victorian society was a world of contradictions. Outwardly, it preached strict morality, chastity, and the sanctity of family life. Sermons warned of the dangers of temptation, of sin, of the fall of women who strayed from virtue. And yet, beneath that polished surface, desire thrived and demand for prostitution was vast. It is said that in the middle of the 19th century, London was home to tens of thousands of prostitutes, with estimates ranging anywhere from 30,000 to as many as 80,000. Brothels, or houses of ill repute, as they were sometimes called, could be found in every district, from the wealthiest neighborhoods to the poorest alleys. Respectable gentlemen who spoke sternly of morality by day often slipped quietly into these houses by night. And the women who lived and worked within them carried the weight of this contradiction upon their shoulders. Now, imagine yourself approaching one such house. The exterior may look plain, perhaps a narrow brick building like any other, with a discreet door and heavy curtains drawn across the windows. There is little to distinguish it from its neighbors, for discretion is part of survival. And yet, if you pause, you might hear a faint trace of laughter, a sudden burst of music, or the sound of footsteps moving hurriedly within. The door opens, perhaps just a crack, and you glimpse the flicker of lamplight upon polished wood floors. You step inside, and at once the city fades away behind you. The air here is warmer, heavy with the scent of candle wax, perfume, and tobacco. Shadows dance on the walls as lamps burn low. Plush furniture, though perhaps worn, tries to give the impression of comfort and luxury. Mirrors reflect the dim light, and velvet drapes soften the harshness of the outside world. For the clients who visit, this is meant to feel like an escape, a place apart from the rigid expectations of Victorian society. But for the women who live here, this is both workplace and home, both refuge and prison. Pause here a moment and notice the details. A woman sits at a small table, her dress carefully chosen, her hair arranged with care, waiting for the next visitor. Another leans against the wall, speaking softly with her companions, exchanging jokes or whispers, their laughter tinged with fatigue. In the corner, a madame, the keeper of the house, keeps a watchful eye, ensuring order is maintained and that business runs smoothly. For each of these women, life has taken a different path to this place, and yet here they all are, sharing in a common reality. Some may have arrived from rural villages, drawn to London by the promise of work that never materialized. Others may have been abandoned by husbands, or left widowed and desperate. Some may be barely more than girls, their faces still bearing the innocence of youth. Others may be older, hardened by years of struggle, resigned to this way of life. And though society might condemn them all with a single word, prostitute, the truth of their stories is far more complex, layered with hardship, resilience, and survival. As you imagine this scene, allow yourself to move more slowly still, noticing how the brothel itself becomes almost a world within a world. By day, it lies quiet, shutters drawn, its inhabitants resting, preparing for the long nights ahead. By night, it comes alive with activity. Gentlemen arrive, some nervous, others arrogant, each seeking something: comfort, desire, distraction, or escape. Conversations are hushed, voices low, laughter often forced but sometimes genuine. There is music, perhaps from a piano in the corner, played by one of the women herself. Glasses clink, footsteps move along the stairs, doors close quietly. All the while outside, the city moves on, unaware or perhaps willfully blind to what occurs within. And within these walls, the women live their lives, navigating a path that is fraught with both opportunity and danger. It is easy, from a distance of more than a century, to imagine these places only in terms of scandal or vice. But if you listen closely, with compassion, you begin to hear something else, a deeper hum, the quiet persistence of human beings trying to survive in a world that gave them little choice. You hear the exhaustion in their voices, the quick laughter that hides a deeper sorrow, the small acts of kindness between women who, though strangers, become each other's family in a house where society has abandoned them. You hear the echoes of dreams that once were, and of futures that may never come, and in this, the brothel becomes not just a place of transaction, but a place of human stories, of resilience, of pain, and of endurance. And so, as you allow yourself to drift further into this imagined journey, remember that history is not only the grand stories of monarchs and wars, but also the quiet, hidden lives of those who lived in the shadows. To understand what it was like to be a Victorian brothel worker is to understand not only the trade itself, but the world around it, the poverty that drove women into it, the hypocrisy of a society that condemned and consumed in equal measure, and the humanity of the women themselves who lived, loved, suffered, and endured in the flickering light of a forgotten age. And in remembering them, we give them at last the dignity of being seen. The night deepens, and as the lamps outside gutter low, the brothel remains awake, alive in its own rhythm. The voices within rise and fall, sometimes hushed, sometimes louder, the sound of laughter mingling with the shuffle of footsteps. You may imagine the way the air grows warm and close, scented with a mixture of perfume, candle smoke, and the faint tang of alcohol. A visitor enters, his boots clicking on the wooden floor, his face half hidden by his hat. He pretends to move with confidence, but perhaps his heart beats faster, for even those who come often cannot escape the curious mixture of guilt, desire, and anticipation that clings to such places. He exchanges coins with the madame, who accepts them with the practiced ease of someone long accustomed to this trade. The visitor is led upstairs, and the house resumes its quiet rhythm once more, as though nothing had changed. But for the women, each visitor is part of a life lived in fragments, one encounter blending into another, nights stretching into weeks, weeks into years. Time in such places does not flow like time outside. For many, the future is uncertain, and the past painful to recall. Each night is endured, survived, sometimes softened by moments of laughter with companions, sometimes darkened by the weight of cruelty or fear. Yet still they rise each evening, dressing carefully, arranging their hair, painting smiles upon tired faces, because survival requires it. And in this endless cycle, their humanity often slips unnoticed by the world beyond. Let us step back again and consider the city itself, for it is impossible to understand these women without understanding the London in which they lived. The population was swelling rapidly, with migrants arriving daily from the countryside and from Ireland, seeking work in factories, on the docks, in the endless web of small trades that kept the city alive. Housing could not keep pace, and so families were crammed into slums, into rooms so small and so damp that disease spread easily. For women, work was scarce and poorly paid. Many spent their days stitching garments, bending over sewing machines until their backs ached, only to earn a few pennies. Others scrubbed floors or carried water as domestic servants, often enduring long hours and harsh treatment. And so, when such work failed to sustain them, or when illness or misfortune left them without support, the brothel became one of the few places where money could be earned more quickly, even if the cost was dear. And yet, even here, there were differences of class and circumstance. Some brothels, particularly in the wealthier districts, catered to gentlemen of means. The women there were dressed in silks, adorned with jewelry, and taught to present an air of refinement. They entertained in parlors decorated with velvet drapes and ornate mirrors, where champagne was poured and conversation flowed before any private encounters took place. In such places, a woman might earn enough to keep herself clothed, fed, and even send money to a family she could not live with. But these brothels were rare compared to the countless poorer houses scattered throughout the city. In those, conditions were far harsher. Rooms were small, bare, and cold, with thin bedding and little privacy. Clients were rougher, more desperate, sometimes dangerous. Payment was meager, and often taken by the madame before a woman ever held it in her hand. Here, survival was day by day, with little hope for escape. Imagine one such woman sitting quietly by the window when no one is watching. She looks out into the street where fog blurs the outlines of passing figures. She remembers perhaps a time when she lived at home, when she was younger, when her dreams were not yet broken. Perhaps she once imagined a different life, one of marriage, children, or a steady trade. But now she waits for the knock at the door, the call of her name, the endless rhythm of nights that blur together. She sighs, and yet she rises when called, because what else can she do? And in that sigh lies the story of countless others, women whose names history has forgotten, but whose lives once filled the hidden corners of this great city. Still, it would be wrong to imagine only despair, for human beings are never only one thing. Even within the brothel walls, there was laughter, companionship, moments of joy carved out from hardship. The women shared stories, joked together, teased one another, and sometimes sang songs late into the night when the mood allowed. Friendships were forged in those rooms, bonds of sisterhood that helped them endure the hardships together. In their laughter, one can hear the resilience of the human spirit, the refusal to be wholly defined by the cruelty of circumstance. And perhaps, too, there were moments of tenderness with clients, rare, perhaps, but not impossible. For even in such a place, humanity cannot be wholly extinguished. Let us walk again through the city streets, this time with new eyes, seeing how brothels were woven into the fabric of London life. Some stood openly, known to all in the neighborhood. Others were more discreet, their entrances hidden behind taverns or shops. Music halls and theaters, too, became meeting places where women sought clients, blurring the line between entertainment and survival. Policemen patrolled the streets, but often turned a blind eye, for the trade was too vast to be suppressed entirely. Instead, it lingered at the edges of legality, tolerated in practice, but condemned in word. And so, the women walked carefully, always aware that they were both needed and despised, both sought after and scorned. As midnight deepens, imagine the city around you quieting further. The carriages grow fewer, the shouts of the market fade, the pubs begin to close. Yet still, behind closed doors, life continues. A lamp burns in a brothel window, its glow a silent signal to those who know where to look. A woman sings softly, her voice carrying faintly through the walls. A client departs, his boots striking the pavement, his figure swallowed by the mist. And the house waits for the next knock, the next visitor, the next transaction in an endless cycle. The women rest briefly, sharing a cup of tea or a stolen moment of peace before rising once more to greet whoever comes through the door. When we pause to imagine these scenes, it is not to sensationalize them, but to remember. To remember that these women were more than the labels given to them. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, human beings who lived and breathed, who laughed and cried, who carried within them dreams and sorrows. Their lives were hidden, dismissed by the polite world, but they were real, and to bring them to mind now is to grant them the recognition they were denied. It is to let their shadows step softly into the light, if only for a moment, so that we may honor their existence. And so, as you allow yourself to drift deeper into this story, let the rhythm of their lives mingle with your own breath, slow and steady. Let the flickering light of the gas lamps fade gently in your mind, and let the footsteps on the cobblestones recede into silence. The brothel door closes, the curtains are drawn, and the city itself seems to exhale into the quiet of the night. The world outside sleeps, and within, the women rest as best they can, waiting for another day, another night, another cycle of survival. And as you listen, you, too, may allow yourself to rest, to drift softly into sleep, carrying with you not only the images of a city long past, but also the quiet memory of those whose stories we have whispered back into the world. When we think of the women who became brothel workers in the Victorian age, it is tempting to imagine that they chose this path with clear intention, as though they awoke one morning and decided upon it. But the truth whispered across the pages of history is far more complicated and far more sorrowful. For most, this was not a choice freely made, but a road taken when all other roads had closed, when hunger gnawed, when poverty pressed too heavily, when life offered no kinder alternative. To understand how a woman entered such a trade, we must first step into her world. The world of narrow alleys, crowded tenements, and endless uncertainty that defined so much of 19th century life. Imagine a young girl born into a poor family in the East End of London. Her father works irregularly on the docks, hauling cargo through rain and cold, his wages swallowed by drink before they reach the kitchen table. Her mother scrubs laundry for wealthier households, her hands cracked and raw from soap and water. The girl grows up surrounded by brothers and sisters, sleeping 3 or 4 to a bed in a damp, airless room. She learns early what it means to go without shoes, without meat, without the certainty of a meal tomorrow. School is a luxury, one she might attend for a year or two before being sent into service to help support the family. At 12 or 13, she is placed in a household as a servant, rising before dawn, scrubbing floors, carrying coal, and taking scolding for the smallest mistake. The pay is meager, hardly enough to clothe herself. And when she grows older, should she lose her position? Perhaps because she is ill, perhaps because she resists the advances of a master. There is no safety net waiting, no pension, no state support, no second chances. The street yawns before her, and with it, the brothel door. Others found themselves drawn into the trade even earlier. Picture an orphan, her parents taken by disease, left to wander the streets with no one to claim her. Workhouses might take her in, but the workhouse was a harsh and merciless place. Rules were strict, punishments cruel, food scarce. Many fled these grim institutions in search of freedom, only to find the streets equally unforgiving. For a girl of 14, 15, or even younger, the offer of a roof over her head, a bed to sleep in, and a bit of money, even in a brothel, could feel like salvation compared to the endless hunger of homelessness. It was less a choice than an inevitability, the only door left open when every other had been closed. And then there were the women abandoned by circumstance. A young woman might marry, full of hope, only to find herself widowed within a year, her husband claimed by accident or disease. Left with children to feed and no trade to fall back on, she turned to the one means by which money could be earned quickly. Another might be deserted by a lover, left pregnant and shamed, unable to return to her family, scorned by polite society. With no husband, no income, and a baby to care for, desperation pushed her to the brothel, where at least her child might have bred, even if she herself carried the burden of disgrace. Each story, each path, different in its details, but alike in its outcome. A woman standing at the edge of survival and stepping reluctantly across the threshold into the hidden world of prostitution. We must also imagine the subtle tricks and deceptions that led women into such houses. Some were lured by promises of respectable work. A girl might be told she would serve as a maid or as a seamstress, only to find, upon arrival, that the house she entered was not what it seemed. By the time she realized the truth, escape was difficult. Shame bound her, fear bound her, the lack of anywhere else to go bound her. Others were enticed with gifts, fine clothes, jewelry, a warm meal, until they felt indebted to the very people who had trapped them. And once within the walls of the brothel, the path back to respectability was rarely open. Society was unforgiving. A woman branded a prostitute, even against her will, carried that mark for life. but not every story was one of pure coercion. Some women, aware of the limited opportunities before them, entered the trade with open eyes, if not with joy. A seamstress might spend weeks bent over her needle, earning less in that time than she could in one night in a brothel. Faced with the arithmetic of survival, she weighed her options. One path promised endless labor, exhaustion, and likely starvation. The other promised quicker money, warmth, perhaps even the chance to send a bit to her family. And so, though she knew the dangers, though she knew the scorn she would face, she stepped into the brothel as a way of taking control, however fragile, over her own survival. For some, it was not just about necessity, but about defiance, choosing a life condemned by society because society had already abandoned them. In their eyes, why cling to respectability when respectability offered nothing in return? The ages of those who entered varied widely. Some were heartbreakingly young children, really, girls of 12, 13, or 14, whose innocence was stolen by poverty and exploitation. Others were older women, widows who had exhausted every other means of income. Still, others were in their 20s, caught between youthful hope and the hard realities of life. Each carried her own story, her own reasons, but all found themselves walking the same weary road. To understand how deeply necessity drove these women, we must pause to imagine the hunger of a Victorian winter. The cold seeps into bones, into walls, into the very air of the crowded tenements. Coal is expensive, food scarcer still. Bread is stretched thin, broth watered down. A mother holds her child, shivering beneath thin blankets, listening to the child's stomach rumble. She wonders how she will make it through another day. Then comes the offer, money in exchange for a night's labor in a brothel. Her heart aches, her pride burns, but her child's hunger is louder. And so she sets aside shame for survival and steps into the shadows. This is how many women entered, not through desire, but through desperation, through the cry of an empty stomach and the weight of responsibility heavier than dignity itself. We must also remember the cruel double standards of the time. Men who visited brothels were rarely judged. They returned to their homes, their families, their places of respect, their reputation intact. It was the women who bore the burden of shame who were cast out, labeled fallen, beyond redemption. Thus, once a woman entered, even once, she often found the doors of other employment firmly closed to her. No household would take her as a maid. No workshop would hire her. Respectable society turned its back, and so she remained, bound by the very act that had been born of necessity. This, too, explains why so many women stayed in the trade long after they wished to leave. It was not that they lacked the desire, but that the world outside would no longer receive them. And yet, even within these dark circumstances, the paths of women into brothel work reveal their resilience. Again and again, we see that they did what they must to survive. They navigated a society stacked against them, a society that offered them little education, few jobs, and no protection. They found ways to endure, to feed their families, to keep themselves alive in the face of unrelenting hardship. And though history has too often judged them harshly, we can, in listening now, hear instead their courage, their endurance, their humanity. Consider, too, the role of migration. London was a magnet for the desperate. Women arrived from Ireland, fleeing famine, carrying with them only grief and hunger. Others came from rural England, where farms no longer sustained them, drawn by stories of opportunity in the great city. But for many, the opportunities proved illusory. They arrived only to find overcrowding, exploitation, and endless struggle. Brothels became the last refuge for those who had nowhere else to turn. The faces of the women who entered were as varied as the empire itself: Irish, English, Scottish, and sometimes women from distant colonies, drawn by the currents of migration, only to be swept into the hidden underworld of London. At this point, let us imagine sitting quietly with one such woman, listening to her story in her own words. She might say, "I was 15 when my mother died. My father took to drink, and I was sent to work as a maid. I worked until my hands bled, but when my mistress accused me of theft, I was cast out. No one would hire me, for word spread quickly. I slept in the streets for 2 nights before a woman found me. She offered me a bed, food, and warmth. I did not know what the house was, not at first, but when I did, I stayed, for I could not see another way." Her voice would tremble perhaps, but beneath it lies a truth repeated thousands of times in thousands of lives. Not a free choice, not a simple path, but a web of circumstance tightening until no other way remained. As the night of our imagined journey deepens, the picture becomes clearer. Victorian brothel workers were not born of vice alone, but of poverty, abandonment, betrayal, and the cruel weight of a society that gave women few options and fewer mercies. They entered the trade through hunger, through loss, through trickery, through necessity. Each carried with her a story of survival, of sacrifice, of endurance against odds that would have crushed many. And though the world condemned them, still they lived, still they laughed sometimes, still they dreamed of something better, even if that dream remained forever out of reach. And so, as we close this long reflection, let us hold their memory with gentleness. Let us remember that behind every statistic, behind every whispered scandal, behind every brothel door, there was a human being carrying her own burdens, making her own impossible choices, and surviving as best she could. To walk in her shoes, even in imagination, is to feel the cold wind of poverty, the ache of hunger, the weight of shame, and the quiet strength that carried her forward nonetheless. And as you drift slowly into rest, let the story of how these women entered the trade echo softly, not as a tale of vice, but as a tale of humanity, resilience, and the unyielding will to survive in a world that left them so little choice. Step quietly now, for we are about to enter the hidden interior of a Victorian brothel. The city outside is still alive with its night sounds, carriages clattering in the distance, the call of a watchman, the faint echo of drunken songs carried from a tavern. But here, as the door closes behind us, a different world unfolds. The air grows warmer, heavier, filled with the mingled scents of candle wax, smoke, perfume, and the faint sourness of spilled drink. The noise of the street fades away, replaced by the muffled rhythm of footsteps, low voices, and the occasional burst of laughter that seems half-hearted, as though forced into being by the demands of the night. This is not a single scene, but many at once, for each brothel had its own character, its own mood, depending on where it stood, who it served, and who lived within. Yet there are patterns, similarities, small threads of experience that allow us to imagine what life inside these houses was like for the women who called them home, and for the men who visited them. Let your eyes wander gently across the interior of one such house. Perhaps it is a wealthier brothel in the West End, its rooms dressed in velvet and gilt, designed to impress. A piano stands in the corner of the parlor, ready to accompany songs or to provide a sense of elegance. Mirrors hang upon the walls, multiplying the flicker of the lamps until the room seems larger than it truly is. Glasses of wine or champagne rest on small tables, and the women are dressed in silks, their hair adorned with ribbons or jewels. They smile as visitors enter, welcoming them with words practiced until they sound almost natural. The illusion is one of refinement, of luxury, of escape from the rigid propriety of Victorian life. Here, a gentleman may imagine himself transported, free from judgment, attended by women who flatter his pride and indulge his desires. Yet behind the smiles, the laughter, and the music, the truth is more complicated. The women are not simply figures of glamour, but workers, their bodies and their time commodities to be bought and sold. Their fine gowns may not belong to them, but to the madam who runs the house. Their smiles, their words, their attentiveness are part of the performance required for survival. Now step away from the glittering illusion and into a poorer brothel, perhaps in the East End, in a narrow alley where the cobblestones are wet and broken. The door opens into a dimly lit room, the air thick with smoke and cheap gin. The furnishings are sparse, chairs worn thin, curtains frayed, the floor uneven beneath your feet. A single lamp burns low, casting shadows more than light. The women here are dressed more simply, their gowns threadbare, their faces pale with weariness. They sit together, waiting, some silent, others murmuring quietly to one another. When a client enters, the atmosphere shifts. Voices brighten, smiles are forced, laughter rises like a curtain drawn hastily across the stage. But when the door closes again, the silence returns, heavy and resigned. Here, life is harsher, more desperate. Payment is smaller, clients rougher, and the risk of violence greater. Yet still, the women endure, because there is no other path open to them. In both kinds of houses, whether rich or poor, the rhythms of life were shaped by the night. By day, shutters remained closed, rooms darkened, and the women slept in their beds, catching what rest they could before the cycle began anew. The house was quiet then, its activity hidden from the eyes of the outside world. But as evening fell, preparations began. Women dressed, painted their faces, arranged their hair. They rehearsed, in a sense, for the roles they must play: companion, confidante, seductress, or simply a willing listener to the complaints of men who sought in them not only physical pleasure, but also a kind of escape from loneliness. The parlor or main room came alive with the sound of footsteps, conversation, perhaps music. Some brothels encouraged a sense of festivity, with dancing, singing, or card games to amuse clients before they went upstairs. Others operated more simply, with little pretense, the transactions direct and unadorned. In either case, the women learned to adapt, to mold themselves to the expectations of those who arrived, to read moods quickly, to manage drunkenness, anger, or melancholy, and to shield themselves as best they could from danger. The madam of the house oversaw it all, often from a position of authority that was both protective and exploitative. She ensured that order was maintained, that clients paid, that the house itself kept running. Some madams had once been prostitutes themselves, rising over time into positions of control. To the women under them, they could be both benefactors and oppressors, offering shelter but taking a large portion of their earnings. In some houses, the madame was strict, enforcing rules, ensuring that the women kept themselves presentable and that the house maintained an appearance of respectability. In others, she was harsher, taking advantage of the women's vulnerability, binding them through debt, leaving them with little hope of freedom. The brothel, then, was both refuge and prison, providing a roof, a kind of family, and some measure of stability, but at the cost of autonomy and freedom. Imagine now the rooms upstairs, where the encounters themselves took place. Some were furnished with care, with clean linens, heavy curtains, and small comforts meant to soothe the client. Others were bare, with nothing but a bed, a chair, and a lamp sputtering in the corner. In these rooms, the lives of the women unfolded night after night, the same motions repeated, the same risks endured. For them, the work was wearying, sometimes brutal, often degrading. Yet they learned to shield themselves, to detach where they could, to survive the hours until morning. Some took solace in small rituals, whispered prayers, talismans hidden beneath pillows, songs sung quietly to themselves in the moments between clients. Others hardened themselves, building walls within their hearts to keep despair at bay. Each woman found her own way to endure, to continue, to carry on through the endless cycle of nights. beyond the physical realities, life inside the brothel carried emotional weight as well. Friendships formed between the women, bonds of solidarity in the face of hardship. They shared stories, secrets, laughter, and grief. They tended to one another when illness struck, offered comfort after violent encounters, and sometimes pooled their meager resources to help a friend in need. In these small acts of kindness, they found humanity, even joy, amid the sorrow. Yet tensions, too, were inevitable. Competition for clients could breed jealousy, and the strain of poverty wore heavily on them all. Arguments flared, resentments lingered. Still, in the fragile balance of companionship and rivalry, the women carved out what community they could within the walls of the brothel. The clients who came were varied, some wealthy, some poor, some kind, some cruel. Some sought only physical pleasure, while others came looking for companionship, for a listening ear, for someone to ease their loneliness. The women learned to navigate these differences, to offer what was required, to adapt to each man who entered. Some clients returned regularly, forming attachments of a sort, though these were rarely equal. A man might fancy himself in love, but for the woman it was survival. Still, even in these imbalances, moments of connection sometimes flickered. A shared joke, a quiet conversation, a brief recognition of shared humanity. Such moments were rare, but they mattered, offering glimpses of light in an otherwise dark existence. As the night wore on, fatigue set in. The women grew weary, their bodies aching, their smiles forced. Yet the work continued until the last client left, until the last coin was paid, until the house fell silent once more. Then, in the quiet of dawn, they removed their gowns, wiped away their paint, and sank into their beds, exhausted. For a few hours they slept, their dreams perhaps haunted, perhaps sweet, until evening came again and the cycle began anew. This was life inside the brothel, endless, repetitive, a rhythm as steady as the beating of a heart, marked by survival, endurance, and the quiet strength of those who lived within. And so, as we linger in this imagined space, we see that life inside a Victorian brothel was neither wholly glamour nor wholly despair, but a complicated weaving of both. It was a place of hardship, danger, and exploitation, but also of resilience, companionship, and the will to endure. To step inside is to glimpse not only the shadows of history, but also the human lives that filled them, each one a story, each one a voice, each one deserving to be remembered. And as you let these images settle into your mind, allow the rhythm of their lives to fade gently into the rhythm of your own breath, slow and steady, as though you too are resting after a long night, drifting softly toward sleep, carrying with you the memory of those who lived and endured behind the closed doors of Victorian brothels. Step softly now, as we turn our gaze from the flickering lamps and worn velvet curtains of the brothel interior to the harsher truths that lived beneath its surface. For though the rooms were filled with candlelight, painted smiles, and forced laughter, shadows always lingered in the corners, and those shadows carried with them the weight of danger, illness, poverty, and despair. To understand life as a Victorian brothel worker is not to look only at the nightly rituals of welcome, performance, and survival, but to see also the risks that stalked them quietly, sometimes suddenly, sometimes slowly, but always present, like a chill wind slipping under a closed door. These risks were many, and they pressed heavily on every woman who walked the narrow halls, who climbed the steep staircases, who lay in dimly lit rooms with men she did not know. First, there was the danger of illness. In the 19th century, medical knowledge was limited, treatments unreliable, and disease carried a terrible weight. For women in brothels, venereal diseases such as syphilis and gonorrhea were a constant threat, spreading silently, often without immediate signs, until the symptoms became undeniable. Syphilis, in particular, was dreaded, for it could ravage the body slowly, leaving sores, madness, and eventually death. Without effective cures, many women lived with pain, weakness, and shame, their bodies marked by a disease for which society blamed them rather than the men who carried it to them. Doctors sometimes visited brothels, often under government regulation, in attempts to control the spread of infection. But examinations were humiliating, invasive, and rarely led to meaningful help. Treatments such as mercury were often as harmful as the illness itself, poisoning the body even as it sought to cure. For many women, illness became an unavoidable companion, one that robbed them of health, beauty, and the ability to continue their work. And when that happened, when their bodies could no longer perform, the brothel turned them out, leaving them to fend for themselves on the streets, where survival was even harder. Beyond illness lay the constant risk of violence. The brothel was a place where men, often intoxicated, sometimes enraged, entered with a sense of entitlement. For the women, every client carried an uncertainty. Would he be kind or cruel? Would he pay or refuse? Would he leave quietly, or would he strike out in anger? Violence could erupt suddenly, and the woman's body was the first to bear the blows. Some men arrived with roughness in their hearts, seeking not only pleasure but dominance, humiliation, even harm. Others, drunk or desperate, lashed out when refused or when their pride was wounded. Though the madame and the other women sometimes intervened, though a shout might summon aid, too often violence was endured in silence, for there was little recourse. To call the police was useless, for the law regarded the women as criminals themselves, unworthy of protection. Thus, they bore the bruises, the broken bones, the scars, and moved on, because there was no other choice. Even within the so-called safety of the brothel walls, danger was never far. Then there was the hardship of poverty, an invisible chain that bound so many women to the life they had not chosen but could not escape. Though some brothels catered to wealthier clients, offering better pay, many others left the women with only meager earnings once the madame had taken her share, once debts for clothing, food, and lodging were deducted. A woman might work night after night, body and spirit worn thin, only to find that she owed more to the house than she had earned. This system of debt was deliberate, for it kept her trapped, unable to leave, unable to save, unable to dream of a different life. Even those who earned better found that money slipped quickly through their hands, spent on survival, on medicine, on drink to numb the pain. Poverty was both the beginning and the end of the cycle, the reason many entered the trade, and the reason many never left. Loneliness, too, was its own hardship, one that crept in quietly between the nights of noise and company. Though surrounded by men, though sharing rooms and laughter with other women, many brothel workers carried deep isolation within them. They were cut off from families who had disowned them, from society that shunned them, from churches that condemned them. They lived in the midst of a city bustling with life, yet they themselves were hidden, unseen, except by those who came to use them. That loneliness was heavy, and it pressed upon them in the still hours after dawn, when they lay in their narrow beds, the house finally silent, the echoes of the night still in their ears. In that quiet, some wept, some stared blankly at the ceiling, some reached for drink or laudanum to push the emptiness away. Loneliness was not as visible as illness or violence, but it gnawed at the spirit, and for many, it became the hardest burden of all. Addiction was another shadow, born from the need to cope. Laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, was cheap and widely available, sold in pharmacies as a remedy for pain, sleeplessness, and anxiety. Many women turned to it for relief, swallowing spoonfuls to numb their bodies and calm their minds. At first it soothed, but over time it enslaved, binding them with cravings, leaving them weaker, poorer, and less able to work. Gin, too, was a constant companion. its harsh burn offering brief escape from the weight of despair. Drunkenness dulled the pain, gave courage where fear lingered, softened the edges of life. Yet addiction, whether to laudanum or gin, only deepened their hardships, pulling them further into poverty, making their health decline more swiftly. It was a cycle hard to break, for what else was there to cling to when the nights stretched endlessly, when the dangers grew heavier, when hope seemed so very far away? And then there was the weight of shame, a burden not of their own making, but forced upon them by society. Respectable women turned their faces away when they passed in the street. Preachers thundered from pulpits about sin and damnation, pointing their words like arrows at those who lived in the brothels. Even those who might otherwise have shown kindness often hesitated, for the stigma was too strong. A brothel worker was seen as fallen, ruined beyond redemption, no matter the circumstances that had led her their poverty, abuse, abandonment, or lack of opportunity. This shame sank deep, and for many women it became part of their own sense of self, shaping how they saw themselves, convincing them that they were less than others, that they deserved no better. Yet they endured because they had no other path. The weight of shame, invisible yet crushing, was another of the silent risks that haunted every night. And still, layered upon these personal hardships, were the constant pressures of the law. In Victorian England, prostitution itself was not always illegal, but nearly every aspect of it was regulated, punished, or policed. Brothels could be raided, women arrested, dragged before magistrates, fined, or imprisoned. The Contagious Diseases Acts gave police and doctors authority to forcibly examine suspected prostitutes, a practice humiliating and invasive, targeting women but leaving men untouched. The law did not protect them. It controlled, punished, and branded them. To live in a brothel was to live under constant threat of exposure, of being marked in official records, of being driven from one neighborhood to another. It was to exist always in the margins, watched and judged, but never defended. Hardship was not only external but also internal, for many women carried with them the memories of their past childhoods marked by poverty, by loss, by abuse. Some had been abandoned, some betrayed, some lured into the trade with promises of work that proved false. Others had fled violent homes, only to find themselves caught in a different kind of prison. Their hardships were layered, each one pressing upon the other, until their lives became a tapestry of sorrow, resilience, and endurance. Yet within that weight, within the risks and the dangers, they found ways to survive, to continue, to carve out moments of laughter, of friendship, of defiance. Imagine now one woman sitting quietly in her room at dawn, her hair unpinned, her face pale. The night has been long, and her body aches. She pours a little laudanum into a glass, swallowing it slowly, letting the bitterness slide down her throat. She pulls the blanket around her and closes her eyes. Tomorrow it will begin again, the laughter, the music, the men, the danger, but for now she rests caught between exhaustion and escape. Around her, other women are doing the same, each in her own way, each carrying the risks, the hardships, the sorrows of her life. This is the hidden truth of the brothel, the reality that lay beneath the surface of candlelight and song. It is a truth that deserves to be remembered, for in remembering, we honor the endurance of those who lived it, who bore its weight, who struggled, suffered, and survived in a world that gave them little kindness. And as you let these stories settle into your thoughts, you may feel the heaviness of their burdens, the sorrow of their risks. But let your breath grow slow, let your body soften, and allow the weight to ease from your own shoulders. For though their hardships were real and immense, your own body lies safe now, in quiet, in rest. Let the sound of these words carry you gently, like a soft current, into stillness, into calm, into sleep, remembering always the strength of those who endured, but letting the memory rest like a distant candle fading in the night. Step softly again, dear listener, as we move further into the lives of Victorian brothel workers. We have spoken of their routines, of their surroundings, of their hardships, and now we must turn to something quieter, more hidden, yet just as real, their emotional and social lives. For beneath the bright paint on their faces, beneath the silks and ribbons they wore for show, beneath the laughter they forced to echo through candle-lit rooms, there lived hearts that longed, souls that yearned, minds that thought and remembered and hoped. To see them only as workers is to miss the truth of who they were. They were women who felt deeply, who struggled not only against poverty and danger, but also against the tides of loneliness, longing, friendship, love, and despair. And so, let us linger here, moving slowly, gently, to trace the contours of their hidden emotional worlds. In the brothel, life was crowded and noisy, yet strangely lonely. Dozens of women might live under one roof, sharing cramped rooms, dressing together, waiting together, listening to the same music and footsteps each night. And yet, in spite of this closeness, many felt profoundly isolated. They could not show their true selves to the men who entered, for those men wanted illusion, not reality. They could not confide easily in the outside world, for society condemned them, judged them, turned its back. And so, much of their inner life was hidden, kept behind eyes that smiled when their hearts did not, kept behind laughter that masked sorrow. Loneliness was a shadow that slipped between conversations, that waited at the end of a long night, that grew heavier when memories of family, of lost homes, of distant childhoods came quietly back. Yet, within that loneliness, bonds sometimes formed among the women themselves. Sisterhoods grew in unlikely ways, forged by shared struggle, by whispered confidences in the dark, by helping each other prepare for nights they dreaded. They lent each other dresses, brushed each other's hair, whispered encouragement before a difficult client. They laughed together, too, for laughter was one of the few medicines they had. Jokes, stories, and small rebellions brought them fleeting joy, and for a moment they could feel like ordinary women again, friends, sisters, companions, rather than performers in a world that often reduced them to shadows. These friendships were not always simple. Jealousy, rivalry, and mistrust could also creep in, for competition was fierce, and survival often pitted one against another. But still, there were moments of tenderness, of comfort, of arms wrapped around shoulders when tears came unbidden. These small acts of care formed the fragile fabric of their social lives, a web of connection holding them together against the night. Love was another part of their emotional world, though it came with risks of its own. Some women fell in love with clients, believing promises whispered in candlelit rooms, imagining escape, a new life, marriage, respectability. Sometimes those dreams came true, more often they did not. Many men left after their desires were met, leaving behind only broken hopes. Some women, desperate for affection, clung to any scrap of tenderness, convincing themselves it was love even when it was not. Others hardened themselves, refusing to believe in love at all, shielding their hearts behind iron walls so that disappointment could not wound them again. And yet, love lingered in their thoughts, because the human heart, no matter how bruised, continues to yearn. Some gave their affections instead to fellow workers, finding intimacy and closeness in the safety of women who understood their world. Love, in all its fragile forms, existed even here, in the brothel, though it was often complicated, painful, and fleeting. Dreams filled their minds too, though they were often dreams of escape. To own a small shop, to work as a seamstress, to return home, to marry, to walk freely without shame. Such dreams circled their thoughts in quiet moments. They saved small coins when they could, planning for a future that often remained just beyond their grasp. They told each other stories of women who had managed to leave the life, who had married well, who had disappeared into respectability. These stories gave them hope, even if they were rare. Hope was fragile, but it was necessary, for without it, despair would have swallowed them whole. Even the act of imagining a different future was itself a kind of resistance, a refusal to let the brothel define the entirety of their lives. At the same time, despair was never far away. Nights blurred together, years slipped past, and for many women escape never came. They felt trapped in a cycle that offered little but repetition. Client after client, debt after debt, sorrow after sorrow. Some gave up dreaming altogether, surrendering to the idea that this was all life would ever be. Despair often came with silence, with long stares into the distance, with sudden outbursts of anger or weeping, with withdrawal from others. It came with drink, with laudanum, with a desperate search for any way to numb the feelings inside. It came, too, with thoughts of ending life altogether, for suicide was not uncommon among women whose emotional burdens grew too heavy to bear. These sorrows must be spoken, even gently, even softly, for they were part of the truth of their lives. But within all this, the loneliness, the friendships, the hopes, the despairs, there was also resilience. Their emotional lives were not only sorrowful, but also filled with strength. They endured heartbreak and humiliation, yet still found ways to laugh, to dream, to comfort, to survive. They created their own small rituals of joy, singing songs together after the clients had gone, sneaking outside for fresh air beneath the stars, telling stories of their childhood homes, remembering parents, siblings, loved ones long lost. These small rituals kept them human in a world that often tried to strip that humanity away. Their social world was also shaped by the neighborhood beyond the brothel walls. Some local shopkeepers dealt with them reluctantly, selling them food or clothing while muttering disapproval. Others took their money gladly, turning a blind eye to the life they led. Children sometimes mocked them in the streets, throwing words like stones. And yet there were occasional kindnesses too, a baker who offered day, old bread at a discount, a seamstress who looked the other way while fitting a gown, a neighbor who exchanged greetings without judgment. These small social interactions mattered, for they reminded the women that they were still part of the wider world, even if that world often rejected them. Religion played its own role in their emotional and social lives. For some, memories of church services and hymns lingered, stirring guilt, sorrow, or longing. Missionaries sometimes visited, urging repentance, offering escape, though not always with kindness. Some women clung to faith quietly, praying in secret, whispering words into the darkness, seeking forgiveness, hope, or simply comfort. Others turned away from faith entirely, feeling condemned, unwelcome, beyond redemption. Yet, the presence of religion, whether embraced or rejected, was another thread in the tapestry of their emotional lives, shaping how they saw themselves and their place in the world. To picture their inner lives, imagine again a woman at the close of night. She sits with another at a small wooden table, a candle burning low between them. They share a piece of bread, sipping gin from chipped cups. They laugh quietly at a story, shoulders touching, voices soft. For a moment, they are not workers, not outcasts, but simply two friends sharing comfort in the dim light. Later, when the house grows still, the woman lies in her bed, staring into the dark. She thinks of her mother's hands, long ago, brushing her hair. She remembers a brother's laugh, a father's voice. She imagines a future where she walks freely in daylight, her head held high. These thoughts drift and fade, and she closes her eyes, not knowing what tomorrow will bring, but clinging still to the warmth of memory, the fragile spark of hope. So their emotional and social lives were layered, complex, filled with contradiction, loneliness and friendship, despair and hope, shame and resilience, all coexisted within them, shaping who they were and how they endured. They were not shadows, not merely figures in dimly lit rooms, but women with full and aching hearts, with stories untold, with inner worlds as deep as any other. To listen to those unspoken lives is to honor them, to remember that even in the darkest places, the human spirit persists, longing always for connection, for love, for meaning. And now, as you let this picture settle softly in your mind, feel the weight of their emotional lives like a gentle tide, rising and falling, steady and slow. Let your breath match that tide, calm and unhurried. Their world was full of noise, yet here you are safe and quiet. Their hearts carried sorrow, but yours may rest now in peace. Drift slowly into stillness, letting the memory of their laughter, their tears, their friendships, and their dreams carry you softly into sleep, like a lantern floating gently down a dark river, glowing until it fades into the night. And so, dear listener, we have walked together through the quiet, candlelit corridors of Victorian brothels, peered into the chambers where painted faces smiled against sorrow, and listened to the echoes of women's laughter, tears, and whispers. We have lingered on their daily routines, their surroundings, the hardships of their bodies, the burden of their hearts, and the faint glimmers of hope they carried like lanterns through the night. Now, in this final part of our story, let us pause, let us reflect, and let us close our journey with gentleness. To reflect upon the life of a Victorian brothel worker is to reflect upon contradiction. Her existence was one of constant dualities, light and shadow, joy and sorrow, hope and despair. By day, she might walk the streets unnoticed or shunned, her place in society condemned. By night, she was adorned in velvet and lace, made into an object of desire, sought by men who by daylight would scorn her. She was both visible and invisible, wanted yet rejected, central to the city's hidden economy, yet cast aside by its public morals. In her, the contradictions of Victorian society itself were embodied, for here was an age that prized purity yet thrived on desire, that preached morality yet depended on vice, that spoke of family values even as it filled brothels with paying men. To understand her story is to glimpse not only her world but the soul of the Victorian era itself. And so, when we think of her, we must not see only the caricature painted in sensational novels or moral pamphlets. We must not reduce her to vice or shame. Instead, we must remember her humanity, the warmth of her laughter with a friend, the weight of her loneliness in silence, the courage in her endurance, the frailty in her despair. She was a worker, yes, but she was also a daughter, a sister, sometimes a mother, always a human being. Her story belongs not only to the shadows of the past, but to the fabric of history that shaped the modern world. Consider again the rooms she lived in, behind those heavy velvet curtains, in those dim chambers lit by flickering candles. She played roles demanded of her. She dressed in bright silks and painted her cheeks with rouge, but when the night ended, she returned to the plainness of herself. That contrast between the mask and the reality was constant, and perhaps this is the deepest truth of her life, that she carried within her both the mask society demanded and the soul that longed to be seen. When we reflect upon her, we reflect upon this universal struggle, the struggle between the faces we wear for the world and the truer, quieter selves within us. It is easy to dwell on the sorrow of her life, for sorrow was abundant. But there was also resilience, to survive in a world so hostile, to endure scorn while still finding moments of laughter, to hold hope even when it seemed impossible. This was a form of strength. Her story reminds us that resilience does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the smallest acts of endurance, in the decision to rise again each morning, in the courage to keep living even when life is cruel. In this way, Victorian brothel workers were more than victims of their age. They were also survivors of it, women who bore its burdens and carried them forward with stubborn, fragile strength. We might also reflect upon how society itself shaped their lives. Poverty drove many to the brothel doors. The lack of education, the absence of opportunities for women, the cruelty of economic systems, all these pressed them into lives they did not choose. And yet, once there, society condemned them for the very survival it had forced upon them. This hypocrisy was not theirs to bear alone. It belonged to the world that created the conditions for their existence. When we reflect on them, we must reflect also on the structures that made their choices so limited. And in doing so, we learn something still relevant today, that judgment without compassion blinds us, but understanding brings wisdom. As we close, let us remember that not all their stories ended in despair. Some did escape, marrying, working, leaving the life behind. Some built new futures for themselves, fragile but real, and even those who did not escape still lived lives full of feeling, of small joys, of friendships, of memories. Their lives were not defined solely by sorrow, but by the whole spectrum of human experience, just as yours is, just as mine is. They were not shadows, though history often cast them so. They were women of flesh and spirit, with names, with dreams, with voices that deserve to be remembered. In reflecting on their lives, we are invited to reflect on ourselves. What masks do we wear? What dreams do we carry? Where have we felt the weight of loneliness? And where have we found strength in connection? Their stories, though rooted in the Victorian age, are mirrors still, showing us truths of the human condition that remain timeless. Desire, shame, hope, despair, resilience, these threads weave through every life in every age. Now, dear listener, let the story soften in your mind. The corridors of the brothel grow quiet. The laughter fades, the footsteps are gone, the candles burn low. Imagine the women resting now, not as workers, but simply as souls. Picture them lying in their beds, eyes closed, breathing steady, drifting toward dreams where perhaps they walk free, where perhaps they find comfort, where perhaps they are seen at last not for what they did, but for who they were. And as you hold this image, allow yourself also to rest. Their story has carried you through shadows and light, through hardship and endurance. Let it now settle like a soft blanket around your thoughts. You need not carry the weight of their lives, only the gentleness of remembering them. Slow your breathing. Let your body grow heavy against the bed. Imagine a single candle flame, glowing softly in a quiet room. Its light flickers warm and steady, a symbol of resilience, of hope, of peace. Watch it in your mind's eye until it grows smaller, dimmer, fading slowly into stillness. You are safe now. You are calm. You are ready for rest. The world outside may be noisy, but here, in this quiet space, you may let go. And as you drift into sleep, remember that even in history's darkest corners, light has always existed. The light of laughter, of friendship, of resilience, of hope. Carry that light with you as you dream. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep deeply, sleep peacefully, and when you awaken, may you do so with gentleness in your heart, carrying with you the remembrance of these women who once lived, once dreamed, and whose voices still echo softly through time. Good night, and if you found comfort in this journey, I invite you kindly to like, to share, and to subscribe for more stories from history, stories told softly, stories to dream by, stories that remind us of the humanity that endures across the centuries. Good night and sleep well. And now, dear listener, our journey together comes to a close. May your mind find rest, may your heart find calm, and may your dreams be gentle. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and let the stories of the past carry you into peace. Good night, And if you enjoyed this quiet journey through history, please remember to like this video, share it with others who love the past, and subscribe for more softly told history stories to dream by. Good night and sleep well.